on behalf of the hosts and on behalf of our partners for this event, the main host being the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies, and the co-hosts being ASAF, SEAS, and the Institute of Natural Resources. It is indeed a pleasure and a privilege to chair the first session. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers, and we will set the scene or context for the series of talks, which, by the way, stretch over 1 month. The number of speakers that we have will give you an indication of the interest that people have in this area of scientific dialogue. And we assure you a variety of talks from a wide range of disciplines. With that said, I would now like to hand you over to the Director of the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies, Prof Jerome Singh, to pass a few opening remarks. And then we will slip straight into the talks for today. Prof Singh.
Thank you very much, Session. So good morning, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies, also known as SAGE, to the first webinar series, or the first webinar in a series that's focused on the theme of why environmental management must become the new normal. Now, I just thought, because it's the first seminar, I just need to say something, because SAGE hasn't officially been launched yet, but the launch will be quite imminent, but it hasn't stopped us from doing lots of work in the meantime. But SAGE, or the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies, is an initiative funded under the auspices of the Science Granting Council's initiative in Sub-Saharan Africa, also known as the SGCI, the National Research Foundation of South Africa, and is funded by a range of different funders, including the Canadian International Development Research Centre, the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, also known as SIDA, the United Kingdom Department for International Development, also known as DFID, and the UK Research and Innovation, also known as UKRI, and that's done through the Newton Fund. And lastly, it's also funded and co-funded by the Government of Quebec and the Department of Science and Innovation of South Africa. So SAGE is housed within the Academy of Science of South Africa and is steered by members of the Academy of Science of South Africa and the Young Academy of Science of South Africa. And I just wanted to point out that this webinar is an event organized by the steering committee of SAGE, the Academy of Science of South Africa, the South African Young Academy of Sciences, and of course the Institute for Natural Resources. And in the context of SAGE activities, we focus mainly on emergencies and also potential emergencies. And so we also take, aside from issuing rapid advisories to the government and to other relevant stakeholders, we also aim to undertake engagement with stakeholders on awareness raising and facilitating resilience when it comes to emergencies or potential emergencies. And it was in the context of this specific issue of engagement and awareness raising that we are hosting the series. So on that note, I want to especially thank the conceptualizers and also the coordinators of the series, both of whom serve on the steering and coordinating committee of SAGE, and that's Professor Elisa Leroux and Dr. Saoirse Naidoo. And on that note, I'll just stop there and say thank you again for joining us on this first series. We're quite excited to launch this, and I will hand you over now to Dr. Saoirse Naidoo for the rest of the program. But thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jerome. Colleagues, we thought it best that we set the scene for you who will be with us hopefully for the next 4 weeks and series of talks, of which there are 10 in total. And we wanted to give you an idea of why this particular theme or topic is so important to us, why environmental management must become the new normal. And I want to begin with the motivation behind the series. And if those in the audience can give me an indication of whether you can see the screen changing, I'd appreciate that. So the motivation behind the series begins with pandemic and disaster resilience, the ability to deal with the shocks of a pandemic or disaster and recover from them. Now, this sort of pandemic or disaster resilience requires approaches and tools that permit society to control threats to human life while preserving essential public institutions and of particular interest to us, ecosystem services, while still mobilizing the economy to provide surge capacity to prevent loss of life and keeping the rest of the economy maximally open. Many economies are heavily reliant on natural resource bases and the ecosystem services provided by ecological infrastructure. And this was particularly concerning to us as a group. This reliance on the natural resource base, but yet this low level of interest in its preservation. Now, pandemic and disaster resilience require approaches that prevent the following. One, resource depletion, where consumption of natural resources is faster than it can be replenished. And two, environmental degradation and loss of ecosystem services. So this was the motivation behind our conceptualization of this series of talks. The fact that pandemic and disaster resilience need to be at the forefront of our planning around resilience, but ecosystem services need to feature very highly in terms of our preparation around pandemics and disaster management. So, looking at the situational assessment and our appreciation of what has happened over the last couple of months, there's been widespread underpreparedness of countries in managing pandemics, emergencies, and there's evidence of very, very fragile economies. These shocks that have been experienced throughout the world, most recently in the context of COVID-19, have exposed a very heavy reliance on a linear as opposed to a circular economy. Environmental positives, however, were also seen, brought about mainly by the lockdown, but these have been very, very quickly eclipsed. Increased waste generation, increased demand for raw materials for manufacturing, the shutdown of the recycling sector, increased production of single-use plastic products, and widespread non-sustainable natural resource use, mainly in the context of water. So, when we got together as a group to conceptualize this series of talks, what emerged is that emergency and disaster preparedness requires more proactive than reactive environmental management. And this management needs to stretch across all spheres of environmental management, from global migration all the way through to air quality. And we believe as a group that perhaps the dialogue needs to move towards an environmental vaccine, a vaccine that embodies environmental management and its needs to be embedded in disaster management plans. Now, there are issues around the use of the term disaster as well. And many amongst us may argue that the pandemic management seated within a disaster management plan was not an ideal approach, particularly in the South African context. But what is clear is that the use of integrated environmental management tools can build pandemic and emergency or disaster resilience. Integrated environmental management is an approach to management of the environment that takes into account the complex, multifaceted, and interconnected nature of the environment. IEM is a framework that promotes a holistic and interconnected approach to managing environmental systems through a goal-orientated and strategic process. IEM as a framework is both theoretical and practical in terms of finding the right balance between development and environment in a sustainable manner. Now, IEM is not a new concept. It's not a new approach, but its application in actually enhancing disaster and emergency preparedness is something that still deserves more theoretical thought. It's a holistic approach to management to address a complex land and water management problems. The purpose of IEM is to integrate management activities through stakeholder committees composed of government and non-government representatives. Through IEM, we believe that we can stretch out our policies to manage and plan for limited available natural resources to be utilized in a very sustainable way during an emergency, and subsequently rebuild our economy on the backbone of our natural resource base and ecological infrastructure. With that context, and with our thinking around how our natural resource base can actually empower us during periods of disasters and emergencies and be used as a springboard for surge capacity during these times, I want to now bring on board our first speaker for today. And our first speaker is all the way from Morocco, Professor Lahcen El Youssfi, and his talk today focuses on integrated water resources management and ethics. And given the raging arguments around the sharing of resources and the socio-spatial conflict that has arisen as a consequence of the construction of dams across Africa and other parts of the developing world, I think it is a very, very poignant time to actually address this area of water resources and ethics. Professor Lahcen El Youssfi is an associate professor at the Department of Environmental Engineering at Kenifra High School of Technology in Morocco. And he is the coordinating and the training head of the agricultural and rural development sector. He specialized in agro-environment and focuses his research in studying developing sustainable solutions for crop production management and water resources management. He is the president of the Science and Development NGO in Morocco, and it is my pleasure to welcome him today as our first speaker in this series. Professor Lahcen El Youssfi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Serchin. I thank you for the great invitation and happy. Do you hear me very well?
Yes, we can hear you, and you can now share your screen.
Yes, I will do in a moment. It's visible?
Yes, you are visible.
Okay, perfect. Thank you again for the invitation. I will be approaching the thematic of environmental management as an urgent issue, especially with the new rising emergencies and challenges that we are facing in Africa and in the world. I will be focusing on water management and the integrated water resource management approach, and trying to make it also to integrate some aspects related to ethics, some initiatives to integrate ethics in the management. So in my presentation, I hope I will not be very long. I will start giving examples from Morocco, and also giving some challenges in Africa regarding water resource management, and also go to the ethics aspects and how can we deal with this integrated water resource management for a better sustainability. So first of all, I want to mention that I am affiliate of the African Academy of Science, and we have a group there of young scientists as affiliates that works on agriculture, food security, and nutrition science. And also I am part of the executive committee of GYA. Just I want to share the information for the presence if they are interested to know about this organization or to join. Thank you. So I will start from Morocco, my country. So here in Morocco is a semi-desertic country. We have more or less 34 million people, and more of the 50% of the country is desertic. And we have a big potential of water that comes from surface water and groundwater from important resources. But we have a very big variation in water resources, especially surface water, with the variation from a year to a year or from month to month. So we have big variability. And also we have an over-exploitation of groundwater because for many activities, and especially for agriculture that consumes 80% of water resources. And we have an important depletion and reduction of the level of groundwater across the country. We have also problems related to disparition and degradation of many lakes because of the consumption of groundwater around the lakes. And also we have problems related to water pollution related to many activities. And I'm giving this example from Morocco, and it can be valid for many countries, and it can be variable from one country to another. Pollution of water related to domestic use, agriculture, industry, etc. So we have also other constraints related to, of course, to the management of water, the policy, etc. And also we should highlight, when we talk about water resource, we should highlight the impact of climate change. And I can give you example here of Morocco. So according to the future prevision, we will have an average of rise in temperature of 2 to 5 degrees by the end of century, and this will reduce in the future by 10 to 30. So we have this risk. And we can see this variation from one year to another in real management of water resources. And climate change also can be accompanied with other risks related to flooding. So we can see here in Morocco or in Africa many events of flooding that comes with climate change and the climate variation, we can see. So with this situation, because the consumption of water is very high. A lot of pressure on water resources for surface and groundwater. So in Morocco, for example, we are going from a situation of water stress to a situation of scarcity of water. So it's an urgent situation, and we need to take it urgently into consideration. I think it's the case of many similar countries, climate here in Africa. So I give this example of Morocco, and now I give you the overview of the situation in Africa, the main challenges and threats that impact the environmental stability in Africa related to water resources. So we have, when we have a problem with management of water, especially because we need to store more water from surface water, we have to build more dams. For example, in Morocco, now we have more or less 17 dams are under construction. And with the construction of these dams, we have a lot of loss of unique habitats and biodiversity. And also these dams, despite the negative impact on biodiversity, they help in reducing the flooding risk. Also, we have in Africa the challenges of pollution, and as I mentioned, the change in microclimate and climate. We have also a big challenge of groundwater level that is declining in all parts of Africa because of the large-scale irrigation schemes that cause also salinization of soil and many other problems. So we have a low capacity in water management, or let's say a weak capacity in water management from institutional point of view. So these are the main challenges. In addition to that, we have a problem of inequality or bad distribution of water. So we have inadequate access. We have problems of erosion, as I mentioned, flooding, drought, and increasing desertification. So there is also a big competition for water use from different sectors, from agriculture, from industry, from mining activities. And also we have a lack and the low of capacity in investment, and also the degradation of watersheds, and including the degradation of quality of water and the pollution of water with the use in different activities. And also we have the problem of lack of data and the poor data that we have available, and also the lack of cooperation between institutions inside the country and regionally, etc. So one of the best solutions to address those challenges is to adopt the integrated water resource management principles, so we can minimize these problems. Integrated water resource management means we should include all the aspects and all the sectors and all the solutions, and to take them into consideration in one thought, so we can minimize the risks. So in order to explain this integrated water resource management, I will go quickly on a case in Morocco, which is a region, Souss-Massa region in the southwest of Morocco. It's one of the big regions that exports a lot of fruits and vegetables to Europe and other countries. And in this region is very important because it has the suitable environment for a good production and good quality. In this region, we can see that there is a big demand for agriculture. More than 70% is used for irrigation, and you can see the state of water resources. So we have the resources available is around, for example, 900 million cubic meters, and the demand is higher. So in this region, we are producing a lot of agricultural fruits and vegetables, and the agricultural irrigation is demanding too much, and we have a big deficit of annual deficit of water in this region. So there is the demand for irrigation of green spaces, for drinking water, industry, etc. But the main activity is agriculture. So there is a need to mobilize other resources that can be available to replace this deficit. So one of them is to mobilize more surface water. So building more dams, also to reuse treated wastewater. So for different, and also for to use the desalination of seawater. And also rainwater collection, and also to convert many areas of irrigated agriculture from technologies that are consuming more to new technologies that consume and have an economy of water. These are the main sources that we can adopt, so we can integrate to have an integrated water resource management. So in this region, we have a big potential of wastewater production, and we can have a big level of treatment of this water, so we can use them for irrigation, especially for golf. In this region also we have touristic activities that consume too much water for in services, but also in golf for sport activities. So treated wastewater can be used in this sense. So this demand is big, so we need to develop all this kind of solutions. So I will do quickly. So in this region, there is a need to convert more cultivated area from the traditional irrigation systems that consumes too much and that have more or less efficiency in irrigation, to more economic technologies like drip irrigation. So there is an effort to convert many areas, so we can have an economy of more or less 20% of water, and to save it for the future and for other users. So in this region also, we adopted the use of technology by adopting a big network of climate data networks to collect more data and to bring this data to growers, because they consume too much water. So they receive messages in their phones, so they reduce the amount of use of water in their fields. In this way also we can help in reducing the consumption. Also at the level of the fields of growers, so we can reduce also we can control the amount of water that is given to the plants, and we can reduce so much the consumption of water. So despite this, the efforts and in this case of this region in Morocco, there are a lot of efforts to integrate more solutions. There is at the moment a big station of desalination of water, so to reduce this deficit in irrigation. But this desalination station and dams has a big impact on environment, and we can see that there are many other activities and many other ecosystems that are really affected negatively by these projects. So for the CIM region, we can, as I said, it's one of the important region in export and production of citrus and tomato. And here I want to highlight the Waterprint concept. That is a way to measure the sustainability of production of agriculture, and also how we use this water. And a good example here from this region that exports citrus and tomato, and they will ask question about this. So for example, in this for Morocco, the production of citrus can consume more or less, we have production 1.3 million of tons, and we export more or less 40% of this production, and we can ask how much water we consume to produce this citrus. So we have more or less 0.5 cubic meters per kilogram, And when we export water, we consume water for production, and also the fruit contains water and consumes too much. So we are exporting and producing and losing more or less 265 billion cubic meter, which is the equivalent of dam of example of this dam here in the same region. For tomato, it's the same case. So we have exportation of tomato and 24% of production. So I give you this example of Waterprint to ask a question: if the system of production and exportation is sustainable or not, should we change immediately the strategies and to adopt more strategies that can have more economy of water, and if exportation and is a solution, or to reduce the exportation of the fruits, because we have an emergency for example, in the same region here, there is a problem of at the moment, in these days, they have a lack of drinking water, but they continue exporting fruits and vegetables from the region. And the project of desalination, yes, it's a solution, but the sustainability of the system there is under question, because we need to have urgent solutions now and also long-term solutions. So for example, this region, it's from a social point of view, it's difficult to stop the production activities because many growers working there, a lot of labor created, thousands and thousands of industry related to agriculture activities. And it's really difficult to stop the exportation and stop the exploitation of water. So there is a need to think about new solutions and new intelligent solutions that are sustainable. So in order, I give you this example to show the sustainability aspect and the urgent aspect related to water use and the economic aspects and social aspects in this region, Susmasar region. So in general, the regional recommendation for a sustainable water resource management demands there is a need to have more coordination and more decentralized management structures at the regional level, for example, for this region, and also for a national level. So we need also to involve all stakeholders, not only water managers, but economists and also social scientists that should be involved in all aspects to make a decision about the future of a region, especially for water management. Also, there is a need to develop more frameworks and also to develop synergies and to learn from experience from other countries and other regions. Also, it's urgent also not only to work on water as a part, but also to work on food and energy, and to include us in the nexus in order to make decisions, because energy also is important. And I know, for example, in South Africa in those days, there was some problems of electricity, and we should include energy and water and food in all, especially when we have these cases of emergencies, so we can take decisions and we have scenarios for the future. So as integrated solutions, so we should think about the equality in distribution of the resources. For water, for example, for example, if the growers and the irrigators and are using a lot of water that is wasted, and we have a rural population that don't have access to water, so we need to change this situation. So we need more education, use of technology, collaboration, and involving of youth, but also science. So regarding ethics, So we had a project with collaborators and colleagues in South Africa and Europe, and also other countries in Africa. So in this approach we adopted, we tried, for example, in this case study in Morocco and other case studies, we tried to apply this approach of systemic relational perspective that includes all the aspects, because humans as users or as a part of the ecosystem are we should respect these humans and equalities, and to consider them as integral and inherent part of the ecosystem. Also, there is a need to consider the ecological and the social component of the ecosystem as dynamic, complex, and very interactive. The ecosystem, the humans are interactive, and we should, in all our strategies, all our projects, our decisions, take into consideration very deeply this relationship, because decision makers, they focus on the resources, exploitation of the resource, for example, for economic activities. But humans, they are not taken into consideration as they could be in order to respect their well-being in the ecosystem, the satisfaction in a good and equal way of their needs, and also to respect the ecosystem and to protect it as much as possible. This is the group of our working group, and we still continue on case studies. And also I want to highlight here that in addition to the human aspects and the social aspects, so we should focus really on integrating climate, water, food, energy, and nexus in all our decision making at the country level, regional level, and also at the continent in Africa. So we work together, we and the colleague and other colleagues, to compare the state of the case, and we published this paper about water, food, and energy nexus in Morocco and Africa, to compare cases of water management and also energy and the competition between sectors, and also to say if there are policies and regulations that take into consideration all these aspects, including the climate, water, food, and energy. And you can have a look on the outputs of this paper, in which we urge that there is a need and that there is a lack of regulation that take into consideration all this nexus, because all the policies are produced separately for water, for food, for energy, for environment. So we need integrative solutions and policies that take into consideration all those aspects. And with this, I thank you for your attention, and sorry if I was very long. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur, and thank you so much for bringing in the integrated approach to water resource management into your talk. I think it fits in perfectly for our argument that integrated environmental management presents a potential solution to building resilience around emergencies and disasters. I'm going to open into the floor now for questions. And colleagues, please feel free. The reason why we have scheduled this to run over 1.5 hours is that we wanted to give people the chance to really engage around these issues. Very often webinars are so rushed and so crammed that it doesn't allow the space for scientific dialogue. So I'm going to open up very shortly for questions from the floor. But Lahcen, if I could pose the first question. The concept of water resilience has become very, very important for governments around the world, and building water resilience amongst their people, their citizens, their communities. But there is an argument that is raging amongst the social scientists and the environmental scientists around self-supply. And what I mean by self-supply is whether government should be making rural communities in particular more capacitated to supply themselves with water, or more capacitated in the context of receiving water from government service providers. And there is an argument, particularly in very high altitude areas where communities are reliant on springs, on whether government should be piping the water to those communities and making them reliant on the government supply, or capacitating themselves to become more resilient in terms of self-supply. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
Yes, it's an interesting question. So we talk about, for example, water resilience, especially in the moment of crisis. So and when it become where we have, for example, some rural areas, they don't have 0 cubic meter of water. They don't have access to sanitation and also to drinking water, and this should be avoided because we need to have these integrated solutions. It's really very difficult for rural areas to have this self-service water. They already have in some parts, when they have, for example, groundwater available, they can have their proper wells and they use it. But when they relate to surface water, so I think is the rule of the government and also the companies and also the organisms, institutions that are managing water. They have to take this responsibility and to invest more in making available water resources and distributed in an equal way. Even that's the challenge in some parts of the country may be cost-effective distribution of water. For example, we have sometimes, for example, in some cases here in Morocco and other parts, we have a big water resource in one region that is collected in a dam. And the dilemma here, for example, you can find that the rural areas around the dam, they don't have access to water. There is a problem of equality here, and there is a need to resolve this problem, because even it costs too much to make the network available, network of water available for these rural areas, but it should be done. The investment should be forced, because they have the right to have access to water, because they have the resources in their region and they are used for other activities like agriculture and mining activities. And we can see this scenario in many parts of Africa. So there is a need to have also NGOs and the involvement of social, let's say, associations and NGOs that should also be partner in finding a solution for these rural areas, so they can also help them. There is a risk also of the quality of water. If rural areas, they have self-service of water, there is a risk of quality. So there is a need to invest more and to collaborate more for more intelligent solutions in rural areas.
Thank you so much, Lahcen. I'm now going to open it up to the floor. If there are any questions on this particular aspect, but if we have covered most of the important areas of discussion, we will move on to the next speaker. Are there any burning questions? Please feel free to raise your hands. You are unmuted, so you can simply pose the question.
Hi, Lahcen, this is Eliza. I raised my hand. I don't know if it was visible, but hi, it's good to see you. I guess I'll go first. I have heard now so many times in so many places where people say water, or access to water is a matter of good governance, and that we coordinate better between stakeholders, right? This is something you said, I've seen it multiple times, and it's true. So it's the management of access to water. Who is responsible for managing this? Who do you think? I mean, does this have to come from government? Is this something that we have, that each country just has to wait for somebody at grassroots level to have the guts to speak up and start coordinating things? Where do you think is the best place for this sort of coordinating responsibility to lie? Thanks.
Thank you, Alisa, and happy to see you. So the question, I think it's the responsibility of policies, and when we talk about policies, so it's the responsibility of the government that should prepare policies based on the experiences and also the dialogues with other stakeholders, because every part of these stakeholders has an experiences during the years about the challenges, about the solutions, about the attitudes, about the social aspects, the economic aspects. So there is a need to reshape the policies so that can bring solutions and also that can bring all the stakeholders together so they can have frameworks in which we have equality of access of water. So I talk about the equality because sometimes when the cost is very higher, the investment is very higher, there is a need to have a solidarity between, for example, regions, and also the involvement of many stakeholders, not only that can be a concern with water, but other companies also that can also help in having implementing these projects and frameworks so the water can be available and also in the good quality for all population, despite they are in rural areas or urban areas. So also there is a need to involve scientists in order to predict in the future any risks that can be in this region or at the level of the country or the region. So there is to have frameworks and also to have strategies that are based on dialogues with stakeholders.
Thanks, Lahcen. I also think if we ignore the government, if it doesn't start there, then it will be very difficult to develop anything that can be implemented, that can have consequences.
Yes, I agree with you that there is a need to have a movement from many stakeholders, so to have this dialogue and to push the governments to have better strategies and to bring more solutions for a sustainable use of water resources with equality with different users, because there is a lot of pressure from users, especially for agriculture and mining activities, and also we need to have a voice for other users, the normal citizens that needs the basic water right of drinking water and sanitation.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Elisa, and thank you, Lahcen. Just to touch on that discussion, the concept of polycentric governance around water management still remains a theoretical argument. And whilst there have been very strong arguments for polycentric governance around water management, I think the concept has not been explored in terms of practice in many parts of the world. And there are real problems with its implementation. And perhaps that's where the dialogue needs to move to. Is polycentric governance pie in the sky, or is it actually achievable and adaptable in contexts such as South Africa? So thank you, Lahcen. And thank you, speakers, colleagues. We're now moving on to a talk that I am particularly excited about, given that it has particular relevance to the east coast of South Africa, where I belong. And the talk is to be delivered by Dr. Anusha Rajkaran from the University of the Western Cape. So we move from a Moroccan to a South African example now. And the talk is entitled Managing and Measuring the Health of South African Mangrove Forests in a Changing World. Given that we've spent much of the morning talking about socio-ecological systems, I think this is going to be a particularly interesting talk to many in the house at the moment. And if I can ask Lahcen to switch off his camera as we switch over now to Dr. Anusha Rajkaran, who is an estuarine ecologist with an interest in submerged and emergent macrophytes such as mangrove forests, salt marshes, and seagrass. Having received a PhD in botany in 2011 from Nelson Mandela University, she was then appointed as a lecturer in the Department of Botany at Rhodes University later that year. Anusha joined the Department of Biodiversity and Conservation Biology at the University of Western Cape as a senior lecturer in 2015, and her current research focuses on health, functioning, and distribution of submerged and emerged macrophytes. It is my pleasure now to hand you over to Dr. Anusha Rajkaran, and we switch over from looking at things through a broad lens to a slightly narrower one in looking at mangroves. But as I mentioned earlier, the importance lies in our appreciation of socio-ecological systems. And if you had to look at any example of a socio-ecological system that demands management in the context of natural disasters and emergencies, it definitely is mangroves. So Dr. Rajkaran, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I think it is still morning. I hope that you can hear me clearly and that you can see my presentation.
We can.
Excellent, thank you. So it's a great pleasure to be here today to deliver this talk. I've been working on mangrove forests since I was a wee little postgrad student. And it's a great pleasure to always give a talk on the mangrove forests of South Africa. I'm just waiting for my slides to change. There we go. So when we talk about mangroves, we have to start the conversation by looking at estuaries in South Africa. All of our mangrove forests in South Africa sit in the estuaries along the subtropical and part of the warm temperate zone within our country. And that is quite different to what you would find in north of us along the East African coastline, where many mangrove forests are found adjacent, directly adjacent to the ocean. So our estuaries provide a safe, slow-moving habitat where the mangroves can form as well as develop. The diversity of estuaries within the country is quite vast. If we compare the extreme east, which is Cozy Bay, in the picture on the right-hand side, we see quite a different picture to that from the Orange River mouth, which is on the left-hand side. So there's a great diversity that is caused by the hydrological as well as climatic conditions that will determine the different types of estuaries that we find in our country. Recently, there was a reclassification of the estuaries, and we have now a greater range of estuaries within the country, and this allows us to manage these estuaries much better because of the diversity that they represent. So the classification has changed from 1992, and this classification is based on estuarine area, the percent time open to the sea, An estuary is a body of water that is influenced by the river as well as by the ocean, and therefore the time open to the sea has great impact on the biota found in the estuary. The types of estuaries are also determined by the tidal range, the salinity range, as well as the mixing processes and the sediment. If you look at the table at the top, the red arrows show you where our mangroves lie. So the majority of our mangrove populations are in estuaries that have a permanent connection to the sea. And we will see later in the presentation that when this connection is blocked off, there are major ramifications for the mangroves and the biota associated with those mangroves. So in our country, we have many emergent and submerged macrophytes. So these are plants that are living within our estuary environment. The emergent macrophytes are the salt marsh mangroves, as well as reeds and sedges. And the submerged macrophytes are your seagrass beds. In our country, we currently have 1,672 hectares of mangroves. So compared to countries such as Mozambique, Madagascar, Kenya, and Tanzania, the amount or the area of mangroves is quite restricted in South Africa. And that is because of the climatic conditions and the water temperature that we find along our coastline. So in the bottom diagram, you would see a what we would call a normal example of the range and distribution of mangroves along an intertidal gradient. And the intertidal area is the area between the low and the high water mark. And we would find Avicennia marina usually sitting on the channel. This is usually called the white mangrove because of the color of the stem. And this is followed by Brugueria and Rhizophora mucronata, which usually sits along the creeks and has these very dramatic prop roots that we see. So mangrove species in our country is quite restricted in terms of their diversity. Cozy Bay, which is the border of Mozambique and South Africa, has the greatest number of tree species, and the rest of the country is usually made up of Avicennia, Brugueria, and Rhizophora. This diagram, I think, is quite important, especially in the context of this seminar series. So we know that the ecological realm is directly linked to the socio-economic realm. Our estuarine habitats are usually called blue habitats, and they provide a large number of ecosystem services from which we benefit. We also benefit from resource utilization, and it takes incredibly healthy systems in order to provide the maximum amount of ecosystem services, as well as the sustainable delivery of resources from the ecological realm to the socio-economic realm. And of course, these systems have to be under some sort of environmental management in order for them to maintain that health. So a healthy system provides a greater amount of ecosystem services, and in an estuary, those services are in terms of protection. So we can have bank protection, we can have protection of the landward zones. It also provides refuge and nursery areas, and quite topical, it is also a very important sink for carbon. So carbon sequestration and carbon storage is very important for our blue habitats. On this slide, what I wanted to do was highlight some of the impacts that our mangrove forests are experiencing. So if you look at the table on the left-hand side, we have our estuarine names divided into the Eastern Cape as well, and then at the bottom, KwaZulu-Natal. Mangrove forests only occur from Cozy Bay down to East London, to the Nahoon estuary. There is one estuary further south, which is the Chilumna estuary, and we are finding that these forests further south are becoming more viable with climate change. But our mangrove forests, one could say, are under threat. They are threatened by the activities not only within the mangrove forest, but also the activities around the mangrove forest. So if you look on the right-hand side, freshwater abstraction. So we've just been talking about how freshwater is used. Freshwater abstraction has a huge impact on estuarine functioning, heavy metal pollution, as well as oil pollution and coal dust and eutrophication. Those are usually happening around the mangrove forest and then impact the mangrove forests themselves, whereas harvesting, livestock browsing and trampling happens within the mangrove forest, and that has its own set of impacts. In the previous slide, we talked about management. The levels of environmental management of our KwaZulu-Natal forests are very different to those in the Eastern Cape. A great number of forests in the Eastern Cape have no management authority, and therefore the activities that are happening within them are unmanaged. While KwaZulu-Natal has more management authority, the activities within and around the mangroves are still having a huge impact. So the delivery of that management is vital in order to ensure the mangroves are kept in a healthy condition that is able to provide both the ecosystem services as well as the resources that we rely on. So our research, and the research has been done across many universities within the country, has been driven by anthropogenic activities. So we wanted to look at how these different activities are affecting the health of the mangrove forests themselves, as well as the biota which they support. And these are just some of the different topics that we've looked at within our research in terms of agricultural and industrial development, hydrological changes that would affect the function and regeneration of our estuarine habitats, the harvesting for building materials. So this is the direct chopping of mangrove wood, and that is for a variety of reasons, from building houses to cattle kraals to fish traps, which are a unique feature found at the Cozy Bay estuary. We find that these impacts are much greater within the Eastern Cape, where the rural areas within the Eastern Cape have a much greater need and requirement for the natural resources. And then more recently, we've been looking at the movement of man-made particles into estuaries. And we've just published a few papers on that, so I will be taking you through some of that research. So for specific examples, I'd like to talk about the hydrological changes that are a major driver of the function and regeneration potential of mangroves. So we know that river mouth manipulations have influenced many mangrove forests in different estuaries. And one can compare it from the estuarine lakes, such as St. Lucia, to Mgobezeleni, which is both in the northern KwaZulu-Natal, as well as further south in the Eastern Cape at the Kobengaba estuary. At this particular estuary, and you'll see the image of the estuary at the bottom of the slide, there was long-term closure of the estuarine mouth. So this used to be a estuary that had a permanent connection to the sea. This connection was blocked off by a sand berm. With that blocking off, the water levels within the mangroves began to increase. Now, with mangrove forests, they have a number of adaptations to living within estuaries, and one of them is that they have aerial roots. So either the prop roots of Rhizophora or the pneumatophore or pencil roots of Avicennia marina help these trees to facilitate gas exchange. And when these roots become inundated with water for long periods of time, and here we're talking weeks and months, these mangroves essentially start to drown. And this is what happened at the Cobham-Harbour estuary, where we had a long-term mouth closure, an increase in water level, and then a massive die-off of the mangrove area. And the very important part about this particular event is that we were able to do long-term monitoring of the recovery of the mangrove forest after the mouth had opened again and the intertidal area became more tidal. And we were able to pick up a sequence of events that would either allow the re-establishment of the mangroves or allow a transition from one particular habitat to another. And the initial part was the stabilization of the sediment that was key to further colonization of the emergent macrophytes. So in this diagram, we see yellow circles show us individual mangrove trees. Either these trees were able to survive the inundation or they were new growth. The yellow arrow shows you the largest area of mangrove forest at this particular estuary. And this was after the mouth became open and there was normal inundation. But you can see that there's very little vegetation and that area essentially became a mangrove graveyard, which is what you can see in the diagram at the bottom, or the image at the bottom. From the time the mouth was closed, the intertidal area was covered with water, there was no visible plant life, and there was a total loss of canopy. Within 1 to 6 months of the open mouth condition, you had the decomposition of the mangrove trees, sediment stabilization, and signs of what we call the MPBs, which are the microphytobenthos, or the diatoms within the sediment. And then we started to see first signs of plant life, which was the salt marsh. Within a year of the mouth opening, the salt marsh cover began to increase and the number of new mangrove individuals also began to increase. And within 2 years, there was a major increase in salt marsh. There was arrival of propagules from other forests, and this was facilitated by the open mouth status. And there was the first signs of reproductive activity. So these, if you can look at this as a disaster that took place within the estuary, and once the conditions changed within that estuary, there was what we call ecological resilience, and therefore there is a progression of changes from what was under the disaster conditions to what is now in a state of recovery. When we looked at the impact of resource utilization, which of course reduces the natural base of resources by essentially cutting down trees, we found that as in any situation where people are looking for particular resources, that the resource they're looking for is what we are not going to find within our forest structure. So we can look at our research or we can use our research to identify exactly how harvesters are behaving within the mangrove forest. So what size of tree are they targeting, and what is the ecological role of that size class within that particular forest? And of course, there we want to think of it in terms of reproductive activity. So are the harvesters targeting a size class that actually produces the next generation of tree, and how does that affect the sustainability of that particular forest? So on the right-hand side, we see our population structure graphs. At the top, we have diameter, which is diameter at breast height. And at the bottom, we have height of the trees. And we can see that in our dark gray bars are the harvested areas, and in the light gray parts are the non-harvested areas. The dark the dark gray is non-harvested, the light gray is harvested. So in our non-harvested areas, we have greater densities of particular size classes compared to our harvested areas. We can also use this kind of research to zone our different mangrove forests and to use that to then identify and prioritize areas that require regrowth. And that regrowth can come in terms of planting, or essentially ensuring that there are enough seed trees around those areas to ensure natural regeneration. So in this map on the left-hand side is of the Mngazana estuary, which is the third largest estuary in South Africa, and it has the largest, the third largest mangrove forest in South Africa, and it has the largest area of Rhizophyra mucronata, which is an important tree for harvesting for the building of houses and cattle kraals. And we were able to identify areas of where harvesting was of high intensity, medium intensity, and low intensity. And of course, environmental management can then be used to manage those parts of the forest in order to increase their health and resilience. What we have seen in the Eastern Cape is a move away from harvesting in some estuaries to sand mining. So at Mngazana estuary, you can often see the scars left behind from sand mining of large hills. This is usually unregulated, and it has a huge impact on the ecological circumstances around where the sand mining is taking place. So we have seen changes in how communities use the mangrove forests. I wanted to show you this picture because it shows very clearly another impact that's quite common in the Eastern Cape, which is that of cattle browsing. So there are, as you would know, in the Eastern Cape, large populations of cattle that would move from one area to another. And in this particular diagram, all the shorter trees that are at the back are browsed by the cattle, and therefore they become like mangrove bonsais. And this would affect the way they grow. This would affect the way they would sequester carbon, and in the way that they would be reproductive, and to ensure the sustainability of the forest. And you can compare that with the trees that are at the front, which is nearer to the channel, which are very tall trees, which are going to be much more healthier and much more productive. Then this is some of the work that we've been doing more recently on the movement of man-made particles into estuaries. And I'm sure everyone on the call has heard about and has comprehended the situation of plastics within the environment. We see plastics everywhere. We're also starting to see masks everywhere. And these particles and these objects are becoming a major issue within our estuaries. And it brings up a very important question, you know, is it enough to just manage estuaries in isolation? Most of these man-made particles are coming down from the rivers into the estuaries and out to sea. And this is because of catchment to coast connectivity. So our estuaries are sitting in a position where they act as a conduit from the riverine environment to the sea environment. And they are dependent on both the river as well as the sea in order to maintain their productivity and their functioning. So we focused on the mangroves here, and with all macrophytes, all plants that are growing in estuaries, they have a particular level of trapping ability. And that trapping ability for mangroves is facilitated by their aerial roots, where under natural conditions, they would be trapping sediment and they would be growing their own land base, essentially. And that trapping ability is now making the situation of plastics much more pertinent, because the mangroves seem to be trapping larger plastics. And once those larger plastics are trapped they begin to break down into what we call microplastics. So if you look at the diagram on the right-hand side, this is from a master's student, Jolene Govender, from a paper she published recently. These are the kinds of microplastics that we would find within the estuarine channels, as well as the estuarine mud. So essentially your macroplastics would be trapped by the aerial roots, and with the movement of tidal water as well as the sun, they would start to break down and they would form microplastics. And this is the research that we've been doing in KwaZulu-Natal as well as the Eastern Cape. And we've been sampling estuaries that have different kinds of developments and threats to them. So if we compare on the left on your screen, St. Lucia at the top, to an estuary called Isipingo, which is in the middle of Durban, which is a major city, we can see that there's a wide variety of threats that are present within the estuaries, but at different levels. So for example, Isipingo has a higher level of development. There's far more plastic, a lot of effluent coming through the estuary, lots of fishing activity and maritime activities. In comparison to St. Lucia, where you have lower levels of development, lower levels of plastic, and lower levels of animal browsing or footprints and footpaths within the mangroves. And this has an impact on the amount of microplastics that we find, as well as the types of microplastics that we find. So these graphs on the right-hand side show you microplastics within the water at the top, as well as the microplastics within the sediment. So within an estuary, there are various components that we need to take into account. And the most important thing here for the water diagram is we see a major difference between our wet season and dry season. And I'm sure most of you, if you're from Durban, you've seen the state of the Umgeni estuary in particular, when there's been a major rainfall event and the amount of plastic that comes through those systems. We can also look at the different types of microplastics, from fibers to fragments to microbeads. These are your primary and secondary microplastics, and they differ quite significantly between our estuaries that have low levels of development compared to our estuaries that have high level of development. So the microplastics concentrations in the water and mangrove sediment were highest in systems impacted by industry, as well as residential and agricultural land uses, in comparison to somewhere like St. Lucia, which has a much lower number of activities. Trishan Naidu, during his postdoc, looked at how the microplastics may find their way from the environment, which is the water and the sediment, into the biota that use the mangroves. So as we mentioned earlier, the ecosystem services of the mangroves is to provide a refugia and nursery function. And therefore, if the health of those mangroves are lowered, the potential to provide that function is reduced as well. So we have, Trishan specifically has found a number of microplastics in different types of fish and in different estuaries within KwaZulu-Natal. More recently, PhD candidate Jamie Johnson has begun to examine fiddler crabs, and fiddler crabs in the mangrove forest are what we call ecosystem engineers. Therefore, they have a huge role to play in maintaining the health of the ecosystem. And she's began to look at these fiddler crabs as well as saltmarsh crabs and mangrove snails to see if they are ingesting microplastics as well. So in terms of the presentation, I've shown you quite a bit of the impacts and threats to mangrove forests along the eastern coastline of South Africa. And these threats range from mouth closure due to freshwater abstraction, grazing and browsing. We even have driving on habitats, harvesting and erosion. And all of these threats will have the capacity to reduce regeneration as well as survival. So depending on the different activities, the ability and potential for regeneration is going to be quite variable. And to look at this, we have combined studies with the movement of man-made particles with that of measuring the population structure as well as other health indicators for the mangrove forest. And that is work that has been carried out by 2 master's students. So are the mangrove forests increasing in terms of their size? Are they producing propagules and seedlings? And are those seedlings surviving from a seedling to a sapling life class? Those would all give us indications of whether we are dealing with a healthy mangrove system or not. So Janine Adams and I produced a paper in 2020 where we looked at the status of mangroves in South Africa using the DPSIR framework. So this is the driver, pressure, state, impacts and response framework. And I thought it would be a good idea to end off the presentation looking at this particular diagram. So we've talked about the threats that face our mangrove forests. The impacts are lower species diversity, loss of production, loss of ecosystem services, such as carbon storage, changes in the population structure. And how we can respond to these impacts are to look at how the estuarine is functioning and how much fresh water is coming through, using buffer zones in order to ensure that mangroves and salt marsh are able to move backward as sea level rise becomes a major issue. We need to implement our estuarine management plans. So we cannot manage our mangrove forests without managing our estuaries as well, because the mangroves are dependent on the estuarine condition in order to maintain itself. We need better monitoring and enforcement, as well as policing of legislation in our protected areas. Environmental education is a two-way street. Not only do we need to educate people around estuaries and mangrove forests, but we ourselves need to be educated by their knowledge. So community engagement in policy making is very important in order to protect our natural resources. So these are some of the ways that we can respond to the changes that we see in order to ensure the ecosystem services and the resources that we rely on are sustainable into the long term. So I'd like to thank the following people who make this research possible, as well as the organizer of the webinar series for the inclusion. And I thank you for listening.
Thank you, Anushka. I must admit, you really did the topic justice in terms of allowing us to appreciate the research that is going on in the region. If I may have the first question, because throughout your talk, this is something that has been troubling me, largely because comments that I've received in terms of my personal capacity as a researcher that works on coastal systems. With the publishing of the 4 returns framework on landscape restoration, which basically looks at how to balance competing stakeholder demands in terms of contested spaces such as mangroves, because we must admit that mangroves are very contested spaces. There's been a lot of criticism that has been thrown to scientists like you and myself around the fact that we are so busy documenting mass mortality events that we're not involved in preventing them. And we have been criticized as African scientists for not using the opportunity that we have in working in spaces like mangroves to engage in mass replanting events, to engage in landscape restoration to the extent that we should be as researchers that worked in spaces that lend themselves to applied research. I'd like to hear your comment on this.
Yeah, that's quite a big statement. Yes, I think in a lot of cases we are reactive and not proactive, and a lot of it comes from the fact that we have a coastline with almost 300 estuaries that are unequally distributed in areas that are both urbanized and rural. And to keep an eye on all 300 would be quite a mammoth task. And therefore, we do find ourselves being more reactive rather than proactive. When it comes to restoration and the regrowth of mangroves, we're currently writing a book within the Western Indian Ocean on restoration practices. And when we engage with our colleagues from the Western Indian Ocean countries, we gain a lot of knowledge in terms of how to go about these replanting exercises. And we're gaining a lot of knowledge on what could work within our mangrove systems. And that's exactly what is the topic for our mangrove chapter. Because our mangroves are very different to what you would find further north, and because they're all sitting in estuaries, the management and the restoration of our estuaries is paramount to the management and restoration of our mangrove forests. So, yeah, it's a difficult question to answer, but I would say that I think that the research that we're doing, as baseline as it is, we are able to apply what we find in one forest to the other forests that are in better states. And that helps us to identify forests that may need to be provided with protection status in order to ensure that those forests are more sustainable.
Thank you, Anusha. I'd like to recognize Jerome, who has his hand up.
Thanks, Ershin. Anusha, great talk. Thank you very much for doing this for us. Quick question for you. I was just wondering what your thoughts were in terms of who should be taking responsibility for some of the mangroves and some of our estuaries. I think some of the challenges we have is there are different levels of government. And so you find national level of government putting in place the big overarching policies, but it's basically local government sometimes and provincial governments that have the mandate to, for example, move communities and to house communities who live along rivers and who contribute to pollution. So, I'm just wondering, the end result is, or the end victim are probably, the mangroves, but I'm not sure how we actually, or who takes responsibility for that, because, at the end of the day, if you look at the sources of pollution, you have to look at who's responsible for managing those potential sources. So we've got issues where we've got informal settlements, but no ministry or no local government wants to take responsibility for that. And provincial governments and national governments also, it's a shared mandate in a sense, but somebody has to take the responsibility to prevent destruction. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts were in terms of which level of government should be taking the responsibility for mangroves, for managing mangroves, and also for preventing damage to the mangroves. Over.
Thank you very much for that question. I think, in terms of the legislation, there is good legislation in terms of how to manage the environment. And from my point of view, this question is almost a question that you'd have to ask in KwaZulu-Natal, and then you'd have to re-ask it in the Eastern Cape. And that's because of the major difference in the capacity of your local and municipality authorities within those particular areas. So within KwaZulu-Natal, I would say that your municipal government should be implementing the environmental management policies because they have a greater knowledge of what's happening within the local situation. Within the Eastern Cape, I would say that the government authorities need to empower the communities that are sitting around these estuaries or living around these estuaries and in that way support and capacitate them in order to continue managing the way that they use their sustainable resources. In our past history, there has been evidence to show that local communities and the authorities within those communities do have a major influence on the resources, and therefore I think it depends on where you are and what you're looking at in terms of trying to decide who is the best to take over the management of those particular forests. Thank you.
Thank you, Anusha. If there are no other questions, I think we are trying to be religious in terms of respecting time given the length of these sessions. I want to thank Lahcen and Anusha for kicking off what I believe is going to be a very, very interesting series of talks. I want to thank the organizers for giving us this platform, and colleagues, we look forward to having you back with us on the 5th of August for the next session of talks. And as you can see, we are trying to expose you to case studies and experiences from across the world and across the continent. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you on the 5th of August for the next series of talks. Same time, same place. Stay well and get vaccinated. Take care. Bye.